Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are zooming way past those cozy Thanksgiving myths and pop culture romances you might remember from early American history. We're going to examine the gritty, fascinating reality of how the United States actually took root. So buckle up, because the true story is way more complex and intense than you might think.
Okay, let's kick things off with an incredible question. How exactly did a 10-year-old girl and a toxic weed build a global superpower? I know, it sounds like total historical fiction, right? But the very survival of the first British settlement, and honestly, the foundation of modern America, relied entirely on those two shocking elements. Let's see how this wild story unfolds. Section 1. A swarm seeking gold.
Picture this. It's 1607, and 104 heavily armed Englishmen land on the coast of Virginia. They set up this triangular wooden fort named Jamestown, pointing cannons outward in literally every direction. You see, these guys were investors and adventurers desperately looking for a massive gold payout. But here's the thing. That coast wasn't deserted at all. They had landed right on the edge of the Powhatan Empire. This was a massive, highly organized union of over 30 Native American tribes spread across dozens of interconnected villages. The British were essentially crashing into a very established, incredibly powerful society. And, as you can probably guess, it didn't take long for these two worlds to collide.
Enter John Smith. When the English explorer was captured by tribal warriors, things looked grim. His head was placed on a stone for execution. But, just as the club was raised to crush his skull, a 10-year-old girl rushed forward and placed her head over his, intervening in a tribal ritual to spare his life. Her real name was Mataoka, but you probably know her by her nickname, Pocahontas, which roughly translates to the mischievous one. This brave kid was actually the king's daughter, and that single act saved the fragile colony from being wiped out early on.
So for a brief time, Pocahontas frequently visited Jamestown with food, which set up this absolutely crucial trade relationship. But a huge problem quickly emerged. The British just endlessly demanded more and more food. What they didn't realize, or maybe just ignored, was the brutal reality on the ground. Virginia was in the middle of its absolute worst famine since the 8th century. To put that into perspective, the starving Native Americans literally didn't have the surplus food the British were demanding. Naturally, tensions flared, and relations just completely collapsed.
Which brings us to Section 2, the starving time.
By the end of 1609, Jamestown was entirely cut off from the Powhatan food supply, and to make matters worse, 300 more settlers showed up from England completely unprepared, bringing zero extra food with them. As this bitter, freezing winter set in, the colony descended into an absolute nightmare. I want you to let this number sink in. 60. At the start of that winter, 500 people lived in Jamestown. By the end of it, only 60 were left barely alive, freezing in the snow. Within weeks, hundreds had starved to death. The desperation was so visceral that survivors resorted to boiling and eating their pet dogs, cats, and eventually even their shoe leather just to feel something in their stomachs.
And well, it gets much, much darker. Modern experts examining the ruins made a horrifying discovery. They found the ruptured skull of a 14-year-old girl. Historians gave her the fictitious name Jane. Her remains prove that in their absolute darkest hour, the desperate colonists actually dug up the bodies of their own dead to consume them. It was, without a doubt, the absolute rock bottom of the whole colonial experiment. Those 60 emaciated survivors had actually abandoned the fort. They were literally sailing away when they saw ships on the horizon. It was the new governor, Lord Delaware, arriving in 1610 with fresh people and massive supplies of food. He saved Jamestown for sure, but he also immediately kicked off a brutal war against the Powhatans. He sent soldiers to attack an allied village, executing a captured queen and throwing her children overboard. It was devastating.
Section 3, a hostage for peace.
Now, this extreme violence completely backfired. The Powhatans launched a fierce guerrilla war. They couldn't exactly breach Jamestown's cannons, but they easily picked off any colonist who dared to leave the fort to farm. Facing a relentless insurgency and, once again, zero food supply, the British resorted to a shocking new tactic. Stripping away all that pop culture romance we're used to, in 1613, a British officer conspired to kidnap the princess, who was around 15 or 16 at the time. She was taken hostage on a ship, forcibly converted to Christianity, renamed Rebecca, and married off to an English farmer named John Rolfe. By 1616, she was paraded around England as a royal guest. It was essentially a massive propaganda tour. Tragically, just a year later, she fell ill on a ship and died mysteriously at Gravesend. And honestly, some native accounts have long suspected she was poisoned.
But back in Virginia, her abduction had basically achieved its goal. The Powhatan Empire surrendered, the guerrilla war ended, and the food supply was finally restored. I mean, with his beloved daughter held captive, the king really had no choice. So, for a second time, this young girl, this time acting as a tragic pawn, saved Jamestown from total collapse.
Section 4. The Secret of Smoke.
Barely surviving is definitely not the same as thriving. The Virginia Company investors back in England were absolutely furious that no gold had been found. Jamestown was teetering on the brink of financial ruin, but they were about to discover a totally different kind of wealth, one that would guarantee the colony's permanence. At the time, the Spanish held a fierce global monopoly on tobacco, which was a hugely lucrative crop in Europe. But in 1612, John Rolfe somehow smuggled premium tobacco seeds. Actually, historians still debate exactly how he pulled that off, but he got them into Jamestown. And this next part is absolutely critical. It was Pocahontas who applied her native agricultural knowledge to make that crop actually thrive in Virginia soil. Jamestown broke the Spanish monopoly, transforming almost overnight from a starving, desperate fort into a wildly lucrative boomtown.
But here's the catch with tobacco. It depletes the soil really rapidly. That meant colonists constantly needed to push outward into new land. Expanding those tobacco fields required one massive resource: endless labor. The British simply didn't have the cash to pay European workers to clear and cultivate the unending American wilderness. They desperately needed a massive, permanent workforce to fuel this huge economic boom.
Section 5. America's Fatal Fault Line.
This dire economic need brings us directly to the year 1619. This single year is perhaps the most pivotal moment in early American history. It's a year of incredible duality where the foundational fault lines of the nation were forged at the exact same time. On one hand, the Virginia Company sent 90 women to Jamestown to marry the settlers, formally giving birth to the iconic American family farm. But that exact same year, English and Dutch privateers robbed a Portuguese slave ship. They brought the captured human cargo to Jamestown, where farmers purchased 20 enslaved Africans. So, the birth of the American family dream occurred at the exact same moment as the inception of 2.5 centuries of brutal slavery. So what about the people who originally owned this land? Well, following the mysterious death of Pocahontas in England, that fragile peace totally shattered. Between 1622 and 1646, the Powhatan resistance fought back hard against the endless, aggressive expansion of the tobacco farms. But despite inflicting heavy casualties on the British, the Powhatans were ultimately defeated, displaced, and forced into a final surrender in 1646.
The staggering human cost really comes down to this number: 1,500. When the British first arrived, the Powhatan Empire covered vast stretches of Virginia, home to tens of thousands of people across dozens of tribes. Today, the only remnant of that immense, powerful society is a mere 1,500-acre tract of land known as the Pamunkey Reservation. It's a striking, heartbreaking visualization of the absolute devastation the colony brought to the native population.
Jamestown's success laid the literal foundation for the United States. But as the sources clearly show, it was a foundation built on tobacco, displaced native populations, and enslaved labor. So you have to ask yourself, is this the true blueprint of a superpower? The success of this single, struggling fort built the nation, yet it was paved with immense tragedy, unbreakable resilience, and some incredibly dark compromises. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive challenges how you view history and leaves you eager to uncover the real stories hiding behind the myths.